Yma ar gyfer ein seminar Cymru ar y sgrin, sef yr ymchwil a wnaed gan Brifysgol Morgannwg a'r bortreadu ar ran Cyngor Cynulleidfa Cymru, y BBC. Rwy wrth fy modd yn medru bod yma yn adeilad yr ATRiuM, yn rhannol gan ei fod wedi ymddangos yn y rhaglen Torchwood, sydd un o'r rhaglenni sydd wedi mynd dan sylw gan the team of Brifysgol Morgannwg. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon. It's quite amazing how a single word, portrayal, can draw together this number of people from such a wide geographical range and range of interests. And it's one of those words which, once is uttered as something which is of prime importance in broadcasting, on television, on radio and online, is somehow instantly recognised by everyone. They say, yes, we know exactly what you mean by portrayal, and by failures in portrayal, and by misunderstandings in portrayal. And I think it has an element for everyone of saying, portrayal is important to me. I am who I am. I want to be accurately and fully portrayed from time to time on the public service broadcasting that belongs to all of us. So it's about ourselves. It's not just about a discipline for broadcasters. It's about keeping broadcasting real. It's about keeping broadcasting in touch with us as we are, where we are, how we feel. And it's a very important thing for public service broadcasters not to lose that direct link with its audience, with the people, in the case of the BBC, who pay for that service on which they want and expect to see themselves portrayed, and feel very warmly indeed when we get it right, and are in danger of feeling very angry indeed when we get it wrong. So this is a subject that really matters. And who better to speak for the audiences than the audience councils of the BBC? And the Audience Council for Wales has always spoken thoughtfully and interestingly on the subject of portrayal. And it has commissioned from the University of Glamorgan this piece of research, which is the focus of our day here today. But I know also that other audience councils have identified this as something which should be thoughtfully addressed by the BBC, and it has indeed been taken up at the instigation of the audience councils as one of the priorities which the BBC Trust is urging the executive to examine and to find ways of taking forward. To the credit of the BBC executive, they too had listened to what was being said on this subject, and they had themselves started thinking about it. So there is now a joint effort between the BBC Trust and the BBC executive to get the BBC's mind around this issue, and at the heart of its thinking and its planning, to see how it can best serve and address its audiences with the outcome of the work that it's got in hand. This piece of research, which we're going to be discussing this afternoon, and I'm sure the discussion will go much wider, is a key part of this. We have colleagues here from other audience councils from England, Scotland and Northern Ireland who've come to share this with us. And it's a particular pleasure to be able to welcome the Vice Chairman of the BBC Trust, Chitra Barucha, who's joined us to contribute to our discussions and I think to listen to what we have to say as well. So with that, I'm very pleased to thank you all for coming for what I hope you'll find an interesting and lively session. You look to me like an interesting and lively bunch, as I've been assured you are. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Professor Steve Blandford, who's leading his team, who are all sitting here before you now, from the University of Glamorgan, to share with us the key findings of the research that they've conducted on screening the nation, Wales and landmark television.
So, how did it begin? How did this relatively lengthy, although in some ways in research terms not particularly lengthy process begin? Well, I guess two things met head on would be one way to put it. From our side, a university faculty, relatively newly formed. This faculty of the university and this building is barely 3 years old, that faculty formed with a very specific view to engaging much more directly and specifically with the creative and cultural industries in Wales, and to find ways in which our expertise, I guess, could engage much more fully with the priorities both of Wales and the ideas of small nations. We then met, very fortunately from us, a BBC Trust and Audience Council Wales, who were very fully engaged with the idea of the full representation of nations and regions across the BBC, and indeed, on a personal note, a group of people who are incredibly welcoming to the idea of research. Carl Davis and his team, all here this afternoon. We have, I guess, we've come to see ourselves as colleagues, and that's been fantastic, and thank you very much indeed for that, Carl. So I think two pretty willing partners met at a useful historical point. So this is a collaboration very much between BBC Trust and BBC Audience Council Wales, and four of us here at the university whose, I guess, academic interests very much focused on on ideas of representation and indeed on television drama very specifically. A happy marriage, we hope anyway, or it has been so far. How is this study going to emerge? I guess we began by thinking about this study rather more narrowly than it's ended up, I think it would be fair to say. The coming of Doctor Who and Torchwood to Wales and to Cardiff has, and there are differing opinions, I guess, but mostly have been a tremendous step change in the broadcasting culture here in Wales. And our initial idea, I think, was to look quite narrowly and quite specifically on the changes that production change affected on Cardiff and on Wales. So our first study was called something like An Examination of the Cultural Impact of Doctor Who and Torchwood and the Recent Growth of Television Drama Production in Wales upon the Identity of the City of Cardiff, and we use this phrase, to some extent, the identity of Wales. Quite quickly it became clear, for very good reasons, that the Audience Council in Wales were interested in something broader, something much more about identity or portrayal, representation, and Wales more generally. And that's where the dialogue between us and the Audience Council was so productive and I think healthy. So we made some quite early revisions. I guess we went through a process, as the slide indicates, from Doctor Who Torchwood to the idea of screening the nation more broadly. We made these kinds of revisions, and I'm obviously only going to indicate the sorts I wouldn't want to go into a huge amount of detail. But from what was going to be a detailed study of Doctor Who and Torchwood, we added to the event, to the report that you have the summary of this afternoon. We looked at a recorded sample of week of programming across the BBC network to examine broad issues of Welsh representation. We modified the way we engaged with the audience themselves to include much wider questions of Welsh representation. From asking people about Doctor Who and Torchwood, we asked them much broader questions. We paid very particular attention, I think, to geographic spread within Wales, to questions of race, gender and class, both in the formation of the audience groups we talked to and in our analysis of the results. We broadened, for the academics amongst you, particularly the literature search, to include work on representation, not just of Wales, but for comparative purposes on the representations of small nations on the screen. And we're delighted later on to be able to talk with Enrique and have Enrique address us about that in particular. We also looked closely at a small number of other contemporary programmes. It won't surprise you to see reference to Gavin and Stacey in the report, but also lesser known programmes and some programmes for local audiences. We also, and we had a fascinating time doing this too, we also looked at BBC Wales trailers and idents as a way in which the BBC, particularly in Wales, we think, although I'd be interested to talk to colleagues in Scotland and the north of Ireland about this, the way that BBC Wales positions or brands its relationship with the audience. We had a fascinating time doing that. BBC Wales is lovely little films, particularly around the Six Nations rugby matches, have become legendary, and we enjoyed looking at those in some detail and discussing the impact that they had on the way that the audience saw BBC Wales's identity. So, this study then can be seen in the context of a much more wide-ranging interest in the issue of representation in the media and in the light of its central importance to national life, the BBC in particular. Of course, the term representation, it should be noted, often becomes synonymous, as I've demonstrated already, with such words as portrayal and depiction. Whilst the study we've produced has attempted to touch upon the representation of communities, actually, in the widest sense, time and resources has necessitated particular focus on the idea of the nation. But you'll notice perhaps already from the executive summary, we have begun at least to look at the way that that intersects with other forms of identity. The research team took particular note of the Audience Council priority for 2009-10, which was adopted by the BBC Trust in January 2009, that the Trust should investigate ways in which the BBC might better portray the full diversity of the UK's nations and communities in the regions of England across its network services, significantly enhancing the cultural representation of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So our study has Wales and its diverse communities at its core, but we hope there is explicit cross-reference to questions of representation across the UK and internationally, ones which we hope to pursue further in the future. In order to provide depth to this study, though, we did return to our first purpose. It did use the clear case study of Doctor Who and Torchwood as a means of attempting to understand how the concentrated use of a particular location, in this case Cardiff and the surroundings that you see here, one of the most famous Torchwood locations can be seen by looking out of the window to the left when you have tea, impacts both on the audience's relationship to the programme and the city region in which it's set. In turn, consideration was given to the overall impact on Cardiff itself and the different though related impact on Wales. So we kept some of the original focus at the heart of a wider study, I guess would be a way of putting it. So this work, we hope, implicitly raises important questions about the potential impact of television drama on the question of identity, not only in other parts of the UK, but internationally. In terms of the way that the study worked, as I've already indicated, it very actively involved the BBC Audience Council for Wales in the conduct of the study, in consultation at every stage. I think there will be people sitting in the room that feel that we've presented to them rather too many times, so I hope not. And the relationship between television production, its locations, and the impact on local and regional and national identity. I'm going to conclude by outlining quite simply the 4 research questions that we think we attempted to answer, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleagues who are going to tell you just how that played out in practice. We ended up with what we saw as 4 research questions. They're relatively simple, really, deceptively simple. What does it mean to say that a city, or indeed a nation, is portrayed or not in television drama? And why is this important in the first place? What sense do audiences in Wales make of the representation of Cardiff and South Wales in high-profile landmark drama, such as Doctor Who and Torchwood? And in what ways might answers to the above questions actually contribute to ongoing debates about the idea of the nation, or the imagined community, as Benedict Anderson's called it? And lastly, I guess a subsidiary question really, to what degree and in what ways do audiences identify landmark drama produced in Wales with BBC Cymru Wales?
As Steve's mentioned, whilst the focus of this was primarily around Doctor Who and Torchwood, the study also did consider representations of Wales more broadly, particularly in the audience research, where audiences also talked about programmes such as Gavin and Stacey, or more local sort of BBC Wales programmes that are only screened within the nation. So people talked about, for example, Belonging, Coal House and High Hopes as well in some of the focus groups. Again, some of this will echo of what Steve's talked about, but primarily the first method that we used was conducting a fairly extensive literature search to situate how we wanted to think about approaching the audience research. We were particularly interested in trying to establish a fairly broad framework for researching representation and for looking at reception quite broadly. And one of the other things that we did before we commenced the actual talking to audiences was to undertake some analysis of press reporting. And I think Ruth and Steve are going to talk a little bit about some of the results from that. We wanted to look at how Doctor Who and Torchwood and the links between those programmes and place and nation, particularly in relation to the city of Cardiff, how this was being talked about in the wider press context. So we looked at a range of local and national newspapers to see how often these links were being made in those kind of reports between either of the programmes and either Wales or Cardiff. The reason that we were interested in doing this, because bearing in mind that this was primarily an audience studies project, you might ask, why bother looking at the press reporting? It's not explicitly about audiences. But actually, we wanted to see whether the local and national press reporting, whether that kind of repeated what audiences ended up telling us, or whether these different kind of avenues of discussion were linked in any way. So it was important for us to look at whether audiences were potentially being kind of influenced in some way by the way that the press was reporting on these programmes. But also because we wanted to look at landmark television and landmark drama, and how TV programmes specifically could be constructed as landmark by people who weren't production personnel, the creators, or people who were associated with it from the production standpoint. So that was one other sample that we conducted, which was the analysis of the press. We also conducted some textual analysis of Doctor Who and Torchwood, particularly paying reference to representations of place, accent, types of characters, and also to genre. And again, as Steve mentioned, we also looked at a broader snapshot week of programming where we looked at how Wales was being portrayed across the national schedules. Again, just to give us a sense of what the situation actually is when you look at Wales on television screens. But of course, given the emphasis on audiences, obviously from the Audience Council and through our own interest, the majority of the research did end up looking at audiences in two main ways. Firstly, we used online questionnaires, which were completed bilingually, and we had 206 respondents to that in total. And because we wanted to try and look also at how Wales was being represented or understood outside of the geographical kind of borders of the country, given the time frame that we had with the research, we couldn't really go and conduct focus groups outside of Wales. So we felt that using the internet was really the best way for us to try and attract people from a range of cities, places outside of Wales. So we posted requests asking for people who were interested to complete the questionnaire. And we used a range of different locations for this. We used our internal university mailing list, the Wales Online website, a very general online media forum, which is Digital Spy, and the Doctor Who fan forum. And we also released a press release which had contact details and information about the questionnaire, and the South Wales Echo, which for those of you who are unfamiliar, it's a local paper, also printed a letter asking people who were interested to complete the questionnaire for us. And this allowed us, as I say, to solicit respondents who were outside of Wales, but also to make sure that we weren't just targeting people who were fans of the programme, who would have tended probably to give us more positive responses. We wanted to try and access a range of viewers from more casual sort of audiences through to people who were kind of more dedicated to watching Doctor Who and Torchwood. So while the questionnaire was useful for this kind of broader, more quantitative approach, we also ended up conducting focus groups, which was a key part of the methods, to talk to people in more detail and to allow them to talk about issues of portrayal and Wales in their own words. We ended up conducting 8 different focus groups. And again, Steve's mentioned that we tried to conduct these across a range of geographical locations and also across communities. And a lot of this is summarised in the report, so I'm just going to kind of summarise some of it. We conducted a Welsh language group, which was held in North Wales, a group in a Welsh language school in South Wales, an English language school group in Cardiff, a youth group up in the South Wales Valleys, a group from West Wales, a group from Bute Town, which was designed to help us get at the viewpoints of some ethnic minority participants, a group that we recruited from the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community in Cardiff, and finally a mixed gender group, which was taken from people who were self-identified fans of the series. So whilst we're not claiming that the groups are entirely representative of any of these communities, we were intending to try and get, within the very limited time frame and scope that we had, to get views from as many people from different communities as possible. And I just want to finish by explaining a little bit about how we actually structured and conducted the focus groups. We wanted to try and get at people's responses to representations of Wales on television in a very general way to begin with. So we tended to start most of the groups with an ice-breaking activity where we asked people to complete what would be their ideal evening's television watching schedule. And the idea of this was to see, firstly, on a kind of very superficial level, how many of them would put down Doctor Who, Torchwood or other Welsh programmes. And many of them did include some of those. People would put Gavin and Stacey down. Some people did put other more local BBC Wales programmes down. But we wanted to get a scope or a sense of what their TV viewing habits were like generally. And it was quite a good activity in that it did allow us to kick the focus group sessions off in a fairly informal manner. And it gave us quite a rich sense of what people were watching across different channels. And part of the reason for doing that was that we're well aware that people's choice of viewing is not really always just about where programmes are made or where they're filmed, but actually we were trying to look at this in a much sort of broader sense. So after that, we then went on to conduct more typical focus group interviews, which usually lasted about an hour in each group. And in some of the groups, particularly the groups involving the children, we also tended to screen short clips from either Doctor Who and Torchwood, if it was age appropriate for them to be watching Torchwood, to try and prompt them to respond to certain clips or to representations of Wales. We tended not to do that with the adult groups because we felt that they could articulate their responses perhaps in a way that children or child youth groups weren't able to do. And as I say, Stephen and Ruth are going to talk about some of the results, but we ended up identifying a range of very interesting key themes and discourses that the participants in the focus groups discussed when talking about Doctor Who and Torchwood and representations of Wales on the television much more broadly than that.
The first thing to say about these findings is that they don't all point in the same direction. And Ruth, there are contradictions, there are tensions in these findings. Our audiences didn't always agree with each other. And Ruth and I, between us, will try to represent these tensions, the contradictions that emerged. Generally speaking, I will pick up what I'm kind of calling the dominant view, although I slightly hesitate to use that phrase, but I will for the moment. The sort of dominant view. Ruth will, amongst other things, locate some of the opposing views or some of the difficulties and the issues that require further attention. Now, I suppose the first thing to say, our first headline finding comes out of the audience research that we conducted, both online and in focus groups, which Rebecca has talked about. We were struck, I think, by the positive response to questions about representation and Welshness and landmark television. It clearly matters to audiences that high-profile landmark TV represents Wales. And pleasure is taken in recognising the nation, however that is conceived, whether it's a matter of geography or social or cultural identity. And interestingly, this isn't confined to particular genres. It's not genre-specific. And the fact that the landmark TV considered in this study was predominantly science fiction isn't a problem. Wasn't a problem. I'll return to this later. Now, this would seem to confirm research that suggests, done elsewhere, that suggests that audiences actually prefer, when given the choice, local programming. As Robin Nelson says in a study in 2006, British audiences always tend to prefer Casualty to the high-profile and critically regarded ER. You know, the audiences for the local product are always much higher than for the international glossy alternative. Now, connected to this, audiences who have direct knowledge of the locations appearing in Doctor Who and Torchwood, and many of the people that we spoke to did have very direct knowledge of these locations, take pleasure in seeing them on the screen. People enjoyed seeing their streets, their schools, their play parks, etc., represented on screen. And a lot of people had actually witnessed Doctor Who and Torchwood being made. In fact, not just those programmes, being made in Wales, and took pleasure in knowing that this was going on around them. In this way, our research provides evidence to support Brett Mills, who argued in 2008 that research into viewer identification, his research into viewer identification with known locations on television, which also suggests that people are extremely positive about seeing places they know located on the screen. One thing we noticed was that audiences don't necessarily distinguish between programmes that are made in Wales and those made elsewhere, in Wales by BBC Wales Cymru, and those made elsewhere in the network. But there is some sense of a kind of growing brand recognition of BBC Wales, for which I think the idents and trailers that Steve referred to, which I'll say something more about later, I think also have some responsibility. Now, clearly, questions of production value are very important, particularly to audiences. The fact that Doctor Who and Torchwood are high-quality television in terms of their values in production terms, is very important to audiences. And there is some evidence, particularly from our online questionnaires, that some people were initially very concerned by the fact that Doctor Who was being picked up by BBC Wales. Not particularly because it was BBC Wales, but because it wasn't London, and because it was regional television, which has it still has, or has for some viewers, a kind of a sense of automatically connoting inferior broadcast values. Now, you'd be pleased to know that in every respect, people who raised those concerns felt that they had not been borne out, that they raised them partly to say, well, we were wrong. BBC Wales has done a very good job here. And I think that appreciation of high production values, I think, has been quite important. A sub-theme, kind of sort of connected to the question of nations and regions, is a sub-theme in the audience research, was the sense that the BBC should actually be giving voice to nations and regions, that it should be representing them in ways that were beyond the remit of commercial television. We didn't use the phrase public service television, and our audiences didn't use that phrase, but many of the values that phrase implies had a presence in their responses, I think. So it was part of the language, part of what people were talking about, I think. For example, that programmes such as BBC Wales's Belonging was valued by many viewers within the context of those kinds of discussions. Now, the audience research also indicates that questions of portrayal and representation are really very complicated, and really for two main reasons. The first is that the idea of the nation itself is not as straightforward as it once seemed. An identification with the nation takes different forms. In particular, national typologies, often with strong regional roots in the cultures of industrialization, are opening up as new cultural experiences and identities are emerging. The national now perhaps has to make room for other kinds of identity, ethnic, ones based on ethnicity, on gender, on sexual orientation. Although the research did not seek directly to determine this, there was nevertheless some sense in the responses that Wales is seen now as an ethnically and culturally diverse society, where some of the old imagery, and I won't say stereotypes because it's not appropriate, no longer hold the central position that they once did. Part of this, I think, is connected to the focus in the research on Doctor Who and Torchwood, which place Cardiff and Wales on a kind of international framing. As John Barrowman said, Torchwood makes Cardiff look like Los Angeles. That's part of it. However, the sense of diversity which was in Welsh identity, which our audiences gave voice to, also includes disagreement. Some identities, in particular those connected to sexual identity and orientation, are celebrated by some sectors of the audience whilst being viewed with suspicion and distrust by others. The fact that Doctor Who and Torchwood are programmes made within a particular kind of genre of television drama raises quite interesting issues, I think, particularly around questions of representation. Doctor Who changes Cardiff and South Wales. One week Cardiff stands in for London, the next week it stands in for somewhere on the other side of the galaxy. Although it's very interesting that audiences are very good at spotting where things actually are located. I know that. They said it was blah, 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 but it was actually just down the road. Audiences are very good at that. But Torchwood, perhaps differently, keeps the viewer grounded in a recognisable reality of the city in South Wales, although often not as most of us usually encounter it. Both audience research and the analysis of the text suggests that a level of realism is important to the appeal of both series, and especially Torchwood. This latter, though it has its roots in science fiction, actually borrows from different genres and offers a view of reality where credible, complex individuals, representative of contemporary social types, this is how Russell T. Davies offered it and how our audiences tended to respond to it, where these people are placed in extraordinary situations and respond in realistic ways. But, and there is a but, whilst genre-based programmes are appreciated by the audiences we spoke to, there was also an undercurrent of opinion that there should be a wider range of representations on offer and contained in different forms and types of programming, of drama programming. Although it was not expressed directly in these terms, what some viewers wished for was the kind of more direct engagement with tangible and contemporary experience that one normally connects to more social realist forms of drama. Belonging was once again raised in this context. People sometimes wanted to see Wales as the object of the programme's attention, not simply a backdrop to it. I think Ruth has a perspective on this. Finally, how audiences actually identify with landmark television is very complex and involves a lot of factors that lie beyond the programmes themselves, i.e. people engage with these programmes not just by looking and watching them. One hypothesis we tested in the research, and I think the research findings bear it out, was that audiences were aware and perhaps responsive to the wider discourses around the television programmes, which includes press coverage, which Rebecca has referred to, which includes the discourses around tourism. Now, we didn't study tourist responses in depth, but our audiences did raise them, and they have a presence in the press coverage as well, and which are present also in the idents and the trailers that frame and connect the programmes, which Steve has already referred to. These wonderful mini-narratives around BBC Wales and its output that both entertain and frequently comment on the tropes of national identity. In fact, looking at these was one of the more pleasurable research tasks, I think.
I gloi, hoffwn ni edrych ymlaen nawr at y testunau hynny a chodwyd yn y brosiect, lle naill llai ni cha wedi gyda amser i'w ddatblygu a'i ymchwilio'n gyflawn, neu lle codwyd cwestiynau diddorol a threiddgar oedd tu hwnt i'n gorchwelion y tro hwn. Y gobaith yw y gallen ni trafod rai o'r materion hyn yn ystod y prynhawn, a chawn asesu hefyd os oes modd cydweithio'n y dyfodol i'w ymchwilio'n pellach, naill llai tu fewn i Gymru yn unig, neu yn fwy uchelgeisiol hwyrach trwy rwydwaith draws genedlaethol. Yn sicr mae gan nifer ohonoch chi dealltwriaeth a phrofiad eang o deledu yn wahanol cenedlaethau a chyd-destynau ieithyddol, diwylliannol a gwleidyddol. Yn gyntaf oll, dylwn ni ddweud nawr bod ni'n gweld bod gwestiynau dal i'w hatab gan y BBF ynglyn â phortread Cymru ar y sgrin bach, tu fewn a thu allan i Gymru. Wrth dweud hyn, rydym yn ymwybodol iawn o'r ymchwil sydd wedi cael i'w wneud ac sydd yn cael ei datblygu yn ymhellach gan ein cydweithwyr ym Mhrifysgol Caerdydd, sydd yn ganolbwyntio ac astudio newyddion yn arbennig. Ond mae'r raglenni drama llawn mor bwysig i sut mae cenedl yn gweld hi hun. Yn sicr, mae'r raglenni megis Doctor Who a Torchwood wedi dod â Chymru i sgriniau Prydain Fawr a sawl wlad ar draws y byd. Ond serch hynny, mae'n grwpiau ffocws yn tystio'r ffaith bod awydd gan y gynulleidfa gweld mwy o gynnwys Cymreig ar y teledu. Dylid hyn cwmpasu straeon bob lliw o ardaloedd wahanol Cymreig ac ar draws wahanol ffurf neu genre. Fel dechreuad ac nid diweddglo y dylen ni edrych ar y raglenni hyn felly. Cawsom ein trawio'n arbennig gan hyder y grwpiau plant ysgol a'r ffordd yr oeddent yn disgwyl gweld Cymru ar y sgrin. Nid gyda diolch y derbyniwyd y gynulleidfa hon delwedda o Gaerdydd ar y sgrin, ond yn hytrach gyda balchder a disgwyliad ei bod yn gwbl naturiol ac hanfodol bod y brifddinas yn ran o ddramau cyfoes. Roedd y fath hyder gan y cenhedlaeth cyntaf i'w magu yng Nghymru datganoliedig yn annisgwyl, ac yn her i ni feddwl ymhellach am sut y mae'r broses o datganoli bellach wedi datblygu'r hen gwystianau o hunaniaeth Cymreig a Phrydeinig. A sut hefyd y dylai teledu nid yn unig dylunio hyn ar y sgrin, ond sut y bydd y rhaid ail ystyried natur y perthynas rhwng y dylledwyr yng Nghymru a phobl ifanc. Hoffwn troi nawr i ystyried natur y galwad ar BBF Cymru i ddatblygu mwy o gynnwys Cymreig, trwy ganolbwyntio ar rai o'r grwpiau ffocws yn arbennig. Yn gyntaf, gwylwyr yn y gogledd a'r gorllewin. Fan hyn, roedd gofyn am fwy o gynnwys, mwy o raglenni yn sicr, ond hefyd mwy o gymeriadau a mwy o acenion o'r ardaloedd hyn. Dylwn nodi nawr, mae nid cenfigen o'r de na o'r Caerdydd yn arbennig oedd yn dod drosodd wrth i ni trafod. Yn hytrach, awydd i weld BBF Cymru manteisio ar ei llwyddiant diweddara ac ehangu ei gorwelion a'i uchelgais i gynnwys pob ardal o'r wlad. Gan mai teledu ac mai nid radio oedd testyn yn ymchwil, anodd i'w dweud os oes gwahaniaeth fan hyn rhyngddynt. Bosib iawn bod angen mwy o waith yn ganolbwyntio ar radio BBF yng Nghymru felly. Yr ail grŵp lle clywsom galwad am fwy o gynnwys Cymreig ac yn arbennig cynnwys modern a ddramatig oedd y grwpiau iaith Cymraeg. Unwaith eto, roedd y grwpiau hyn yn dueddol o ganmol BBF Cymru ar lwyddiant Doctor Who a Torchwood, a nodwyd sawl un balchder pan yn gweld rhywfaint o'r iaith Gymraeg yn dod yn weladwy trwy'r gwaith ffilm a sain yn arbennig. Nodwyd hefyd ei bod yn digon resymol bod nifer o straeon yn cymryd lle yn y brifddinas, gyda gwylwyr yn dehongli hyn yn gredadwy ac yn adlewyrchu reality o fywyd gwleidyddol y wlad. Wedi dweud hyn, roedd achosion ynglyn â'r ffaith nad oedd digon o adlewyrchiad o fywyd modern y Cymru Cymraeg yn cael ei ddarlledu tu allan i S4C. Nawr yn amlwg, mae hyn yn broblem cymhleth dros ben. Ar un llaw, mae'n dangos cymhlethdod y perthynas rhwng BBF Cymru ag S4C, yn arbennig gan nad yw'r gynulleidfa wastad yn nodi pwy sydd yn cynhyrchu rhaglenni teledu. Ar y llaw arall, mae hefyd yn awgrymu bod angen i BBF Cymru, a hwyrach y BBF yn gyffredinol, ail feddwl sut mae bywyd modern cenedl dwyieithog yn cael ei hadlewyrchu trwy ddrama ar y sgrin bach. Byddai'n digon hawdd dweud mae gwaith S4C ydyw i wneud hynny, a digon hawdd a hwyrach resymol hefyd, i hawlio nad oes chwant gan y gynulleidfa ehangach gweld a chlywed bywyd dwyieithog ar ein sgriniau. Ond byddai'r fath honiad, pe byddai'n cael ei wneud, yn anwybyddu sawl ffaith. Bod y Cymru di-Gymraeg, enghraifft, yn digon cyfarwydd bellach a gweld yr iaith ym mywyd cyhoeddus. A bod gweddill y byd yn rhan fwyaf yn 2 neu'n 3 ieithog, ac felly hwyrach ddim yn poeni gymaint am weld arwyddion mewn mwy nag un iaith, enghraifft. Ydy'n bosib, felly, i gynhyrchwyr ac ysgrifenwyr teledu creu byd dwyieithog naturiol yn raglenni Saesneg BBC Cymru? Beth yw cost o beidio wneud hyn? Credaf os nad yw'r BBC yn ymrwymo ar testun hwn mewn ffordd creadigol, gallent colli allan ar un o'r pethau pwysicaf i unrhyw wasanaeth darlledu cyhoeddus, sef y perthynas dinesig rhwng y gynulleidfa a'r cynhyrchwyr a'r darlledydd teledu. Yn drydydd ac yn olaf, hoffwn troi i'n grŵp ethnig lleiafrifol. Bu sawl un yn erfyn arnom fan hyn i gyfleu i BBC Cymru bod angen meddwl yn ddyfnach am sut mae grwpiau ethnig yng Nghymru yn cael eu hadlewyrchu a'i hanerch fel gwylwyr a gwrandawyr. Gyda llaw, bu nifer ohonynt yn adrodd mae BBC yr byd, BBC World Service, oedd y brif gwasanaeth a defnyddiwyd pob dydd. Trawiadol iawn oedd clywed pobl yn sôn am ei brofiad o weld gwaith ffilmio yn digwydd yn ei gymuned ar gyfer Torchwood. Lle nodwyd rai o'r grwpiau Cardydd eraill pleser mewn gweld eu strydoedd yn cael ei ddefnyddio fel set ffilmio. Fan hyn, teimlad o gael ei gau allan am mynegwyd, gyda'r security arferol a ddefnyddiwyd tra'n ffilmio yn cael ei ddehongli fel perthi. Daw llunella'r bardd a luniwyd y geiriau ar flaen canolfan y Millennium Gwyneth Lewis i'n meddwl yn y gyd-destun hwn. Beth yw perthyn, gofynnau, ond perthi sydd yn cael dieithriaid allan. I gloi, hoffem ni fel tîm cydnabod bod trafodaeth ar sut y gellir BBC Cymru fel darlledwr cyhoeddus cwmpasu amrywioldeb hanesion y genedl, tra'n dioddgelu a datblygu safon raglenni, yn un sydd yn mynd i fod yn feiddgar iawn. Gwnaeth datganiadau syml ar Gymreigtod ac ar gynulleidfaoedd Cymraeg mor tro. Bydd oes modd osgoi'r ffaith y chwaith dwi'n credu bod gwahaniaethau pwysig rhwng y gynulleidfaoedd eu hunain. Mewn cyd-destun wahanol, dywed y cyfarwyddwr theatr Jatinda Verma bod angen i bawb ym Mhrydain sydd am ymrwymo a thestun hunaniaeth derbyn y bydd yna yn ei geiriau o multicultural abrasions. Rydym ni wedi derbyn gweld bod yna rhywbeth tebyg yn sgil y prosiect hwn. A mae hyn yn enwedig o glir i ni pan oeddwn ni'n ymdrin ar rywoldeb ar y sgrin, lle clywsom gwahaniaethau mawr, nid yn unig rhwng grwpiau ffocws, ond tu fewn iddynt hefyd. Nid ffeiledd modatl o'r fath, ond tys dwi'n credu o gallu y gynulleidfa i drafod ar draws y fath perthi sydd hwyrach ei hunain yn rhan o sut yr ydym yn perthi gyda'n gilydd. Ac ar y nodyn hwnnw, dwi am gloi a gofyn os oes gennych chi unrhyw gwestiynau neu sylwadau i wneud. Naill ai trwy gyfrwng y Gymraeg neu'r Saesneg. Has anybody got any questions that you would like to ask or comments to any of us?
You repeatedly used the word representation, and you actually then said the word becomes synonymous with portrayal. Does that actually give the background to the very complicated conclusions that your study has actually thrown up? Not unexpected, because to a large extent, I think it's about defining the expectation of audiences, and audiences being just so diverse. So, do you want to just expand on that a little bit?
I don't know. That's a very that was a really long question to start with. I don't know. Do you want to come in on that?
Essentially, what I'm saying is, can representation actually be synonymous with portrayal? I suppose that's really what I'm saying.
Yeah, you go ahead.
The short answer is no. I suppose one of the key things for us is to understand the fact that and the reason why we as academics want to use the term representation and not portrayal is because it is a representation. It's a process by which that which may or may not be familiar is reintroduced to us, and in that process is mediated differently. And so the problem with portrayal, I suppose, is that it does establish rather too simplistic a relationship between what's on screen and the complex social world that we all inhabit. It's difficult, having said that, of course, to get away from the fact that any discussion about representation when engaging with issues of identity, be they national or sexual identities or gender identities, is always going to require some engagement with the way in which particular social groups are sort of drawn or delineated in television. That's why there's, I think, so much literature that looks at the area of stereotyping, for example, and really, really important work that's looked at that. I think something like Karen Ross's work, for example, that's looked at the representation in terms of age differences and the real generational differences in people's viewing of the BBC. But for me, I think the representation is where the complexity lies, and that's the challenge, and that's the richness for us.
James Cohen from the Audience Council Scotland. Was there a difference in the feedback for representation of Wales in terms of Torchwood and Doctor Who? Because whilst Torchwood is identified as distinctly Welsh through the writing, the accent, and the location, Doctor Who is very generic in terms of it's very fixed and could be seen as very English. So did that come through in the research?
Certainly I think audiences were more willing to talk about Torchwood in quite specific terms. They could refer more obviously to particular locations or particular episodes and sequences within episodes much more readily. So Torchwood, as you say, is much more available to be talked about in terms of how it represents Cardiff and South Wales. I suppose one of the things about Doctor Who was that because, for some audiences, because it was already known, the fact that it was now being relocated to Wales it made it somehow more significant. It's because they know that it's in Wales and that it wasn't previously, is itself subject to comment and interest. And there's a kind of game that some members of the audience played, which was actually spotting where it actually was. You know, it's kind of disguised. It's actually it's a council estate in London in terms of the narrative, but actually no, it wasn't. It was actually somewhere in Newport, or it was somewhere in Ely, So in Cardiff. So there's a kind of slightly different sort of engagement with place and space, but whilst at the same time a real recognition and appreciation of the fact that this was Wales, even when you couldn't see it in those terms.
I think that the points noted about the ident and actually placing Torchwood from Wales, certainly on BBC Scotland, they always announce that we're going over to Cardiff for the next episode. That's what they say.
Oh, right,
for
that's
Doctor
interesting.
Who, we don't get that. Maybe there should be more of that with Doctor Who.
West television and national representations. I was thinking about representations and portrait. Sometimes a painter can paint a portrait and you don't feel represented in that portrait. So representation in that sense needs a kind of engagement also, a kind of collective engagement. And anyway, I want to start telling you that also thank you, to BBC Trust and BBC Council for inviting me and your support. And for Televisió de Catalunya, as for many other public television corporations in the world, the BBC has been still is the model to follow. So perhaps it's a little bit paradoxical that I have been asked to talk about the case, as we Catalan have much more things to learn from you than vice versa, I'm sure. And the reason why BBC is the international model for the public television corporation is among a large list of factors because your commitment with this type of events and the support that you give to research like the one we are discussing here, I'm sure. And also because you do things like invite a young scholar like me from Catalonia. I have to say I'm not a professor. In Spanish we say profesor, but I only hold a PhD from the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. I don't have this level, this academic level. But anyway, I think I can contribute a little bit to the debate here. And well, this is a topic in which you are broadly recognized to have the international leadership. Television drama. It's just to say this. And first of all, I want to congratulate the team of Cardiff School of Creative and Cultural Industries at the University of Glamorgan. This is a well-grounded research with a complex methodological apparatus and an interesting and relevant findings relating to the topic, which I comment right now. But first, a theoretical note, maybe to my approach. Always my approach to the analysis of television and national identity is from the social constructivism. So there is not an history of Wales or Catalonia. There are different stories about Wales. So that is to say that the nation is mainly a discourse and a way of ordering or thinking about the social, the political, and the cultural. So nationalism is the ideology backing the constitution and conservation of the nation. We could have an imagined nation in Benedict Anderson terms, but we cannot avoid the consideration that nations have material infrastructures. In a metaphorical sense, nations are built by ideas in its symbolic dimensions and bricks in its pragmatics. And it is still unknown what sustains this building, whether the ideas or the bricks. The national discourses are articulated on a tradition, but from this perspective, the past is also a construction done from the present. In Eric Hobsbawm terms, the tradition is invented. It is a selection from the history. And finally, I would like to consider the idea of the banalization of the nations, articulated by Michael Billig. All these scholars are from the British and Anglo-Saxon sphere. Discourse regarding well-established states like Spain or Britain are indeed banalized, taken for granted. Banal nationalism is perhaps the most powerful type of nationalism. It is in the unnoticed flag on the school gate, is in the president's picture hanging in the office, is the language of the official forms when applying to public powers, and it is also the taken for granted television representations of our society. What it seems clear to me is that national discourses are competing in media scenarios, and television fiction is a great platform to purposefully or not put these discourses into viewers' home. Wales and Catalonia are very different countries, of course. We have here some figures. I took them from several internet sources, so I hope all is okay. But we consider ourselves what is known as stateless nations. This can be also problematic, as we already form part of a state. For example, among a lot of differences, in Spain we suffered a civil war last century, and a period of 40 years of dictatorship in which regional languages and cultural expressions other than official Spanish were banned. Another example, I said a stateless nation, but a Spanish state does not accept the consideration of Catalonia as nation, like Wales and Scotland are recognized by the British state. We have also a regional parliament, of course, in Catalonia. We are ruled by a left-wing coalition, and in our case, the demand for independence is growing. Civil society is organizing. Last week there was one of these referendums, not binding referendums for independence in the villages and counties. In Catalonia we have a bilingual reality. Almost all population understand Catalan and Spanish, but Spanish people living outside Catalonia cannot easily understand Catalan, and that's important to understand television structure. We have also a public television since corporation since 1983, Televisió de Catalunya. It is exclusively in Catalan, despite Spanish can be heard in some ads, current affairs programs, even fictions. But it's worthy to note that the financial power of TVC cannot be compared with the BBC capacity. Maybe we could compare much more BBC with Spanish television, TVE, but anyway. Okay. Catalan television does not have products like Doctor Who. We don't have this kind of high-profile productions. The leading drama series in Catalan television is Vendel Pla, a local product but more close to soap opera style. We had some genre TV, Cops and Crimes, but with little success. All TVC productions have a high profile in terms of cultural proximity, but a middle profile in terms of production quality. The research I have done is mainly focused on soap operas in Catalonia and also in Scotland. For example, I studied, River City from Scotland, comparing it to El Cor de la Ciutat, the heart of the city, located in Glasgow and Barcelona. I see the cultural proximity as a process of production meaning. This process is organized in 3 stages: production, TV text, and reception. Cultural proximity is differently worked and understood in each stage by the actors involved. They are, for example, executive producers doing television products close to the audience expectations. There are other actors involved in the productions, like script writers, TV fiction actors, and all the staff producing fiction. But in my view, the television text itself is another actor. Once the production is on air, in the internet, etc., it has its own life. Television texts can be decoded differently, but they are like they are. And finally, the viewers, which are perhaps the most important actor in this process, as they complete the meaning of this product depending on a large list of variables from education to personal life. Thus, producers are not the only responsible actors of this process. And especially because the process happened in a specific context with cultural policies, economic determinants, cultural background, media, feedback, etc. And it is a circular process, not a top-down line. We don't have to think that we are producing from the top to the audiences, kind of meanings, but in all directions. I will now, having said that, with your permission, I would like to comment some of the interesting findings presented in this report. These ideas are taken from the brief version of the project and compared with the Catalan case in my research experience data. At your leisure, you will find some of the content of the report and then my comments and thoughts. About the BBC's commitment to the nations and regions. The British public television compromise with nations and regions does not have a parallel in Spain. This is just great for you. In the early 80s, when regional parliament in Spain started to launch their media corporation, TVE did not have this commitment. Specifically in Catalonia, Spanish television had a production center, but not a clear project for the future, not this commitment in terms of language and cultural respect for internet diversity. The result was the creation of autonomic televisions and the retract of the regional structure. Today, 12 regional public corporations are broadcasting in Spain, and TVE is competing with them for the audience. All of these corporations are have deficits on their accounts. It's a very costly process for the country, for Spain in general. By your side, the BBC created a strong regional structure. Thus, BBC Wales is doing the function of the Welsh National Television with S4C, or competing with S4C. But this model can also be controversial if national Welsh, the people, does not see this television as proximate. In the Scottish case, the Scottish Broadcasting Commission is studying the possibility to launch a Scottish corporation. This would be more similar to the Catalan case, and this is an interesting line of debate. About the UK network, there is not a Spanish network like UK. We have autonomic channels, working aside, no? Associate in order to share images, programs, and negotiate rights, but is not a network. So Andalusian viewers never watch Catalan programs. In my opinion, this is pernicious for a better knowing among Spanish regions and nations. Representations of TV and private channels are much more homogenized. For example, there is not any TVE fiction series located in Barcelona, Valencia or Bilbao. All Spanish TV fiction is located in Madrid, explicitly or not. About the credible and well-produced television avoiding stereotypes. This is the same in Catalonia, and my impression is that a successful representation of national diversity relays in country-based script writers and producers, good public funding and professional expertise. There is not, in my opinion, there is not another formula, maybe, but funding, people working, people who knows what are they talking about, money and expertise. Regarding regional quotas, the fact is that television is a centralized medium. The production has a centripetal tendency. More than in ideological reasons, this is based in financial determinants. It is cheaper to concentrate production in few locations, to have the professionals around these locations, to travel the less as possible. To overcome this tendency is possible, but it requires financial efforts. Regarding complexity and identities, I'm very glad to find complexity and even contradictions in this report. I would be a little bit worried if you don't find contradictions, because national identity and television is a field for complexity and contradictions. It's a field for a complex thought. And the complexity of representations always requires financial efforts, like casting, location. But there is a symbolic dimension also, something related to ideological structures. We usually don't realize about this complexity, and when doing so, we do it in stereotypical ways. This also happened in Catalonia, of course. The issue of genre TV or generalist, we say generalist TV. I know that is not correct in English, but I think that you will understand what I'm doing. This is very different in Catalonia. As we have reduced market dimension of only 10 million Catalan speakers, the public TV cannot produce target TV fiction. Other cheaper programs can reach segment of public, but the cost of fiction does not permit to address only a target. When TVC tried to do this, unfortunately, they failed. An example is the TV series Crimes, inspired in X-Files in the 90s. It was a failure in terms of audience ratings. Producers argue that when you are small, you cannot address to a target. In that sense, the Welsh case is successful, because you are addressing to a large audience in English. So you can keep a high production profile and closer to the American model to produce a more genre TV fiction. And I assume that this is thanks to the comfortable BBC financial umbrella. About landmark television, this is not a choice in the Catalan case, but a mandate. Market and social reasons do not permit a genre-based drama by now. The focus is to produce quality drama based on script writing. Quality writing, dialogues, good performance of actors, etc. It is not possible to sink an ocean liner, to smash a helicopter into a building. So it is too costly to produce genre drama like cop shows, science fiction, or supernatural series. And regarding what audience look for, I would not straight say that small national audiences look for representations of their cultural identity. But I would maintain that they want quality drama, and proximity is an added value. Catalan audiences want to recognize stories, places, and characters. And landmark becomes a kind of difference or distinction in a multi-competitive scenario. Landmark is a tool to differentiate our product from international products. BBC can produce genre TV fiction much better than TVC, but BBC would never do a telenovela based on a Catalan village. Of course, Catalan audience love American series, but Catalan productions are most viewed. TVC bets for TV for all programming, what is also the formula for other Spanish television. Similarly than in Wales, other factors outside the programs are crucial to understand how audience decode Catalan productions. For example, discourses about the rural and the urban, or discourses about specific sectors, farming, wine production, tourism. I am very happy to realize that you also highlight this in your report. The research I have done makes me consider proximity as something more related to discourse than to culture or nation. In terms of audience, what gives a sense of proximity is not only the comparison of what we watch and what we live, but what we watch and what we watch. Let me explain. Viewers consider something close to them when they recognize it. I know this because I have read about it. I watch something in the TV like this. So the perception of cultural proximity has strong links with social discourses around Catalonia or Wales, with media products, with literature, with popular culture, with hegemonic discourses on culture and society. This can be indeed more important than the direct experience of the audience with their environment. And the word hegemony has come to us. For me, it's very important. Representations in television always reproduce these hegemonic discourses. When you are representing Britain, Scotland and Wales claim for, when you represent Wales, North Wales claim for, and it's the same for Catalan. If you put a television in North Wales, maybe I'm sure that a little region in North Wales will say, okay, but, because I'm sure that at the end we must go to almost to the families or individuals. And about the sense of realism, I want also to say something about that. Jointly with Hugh O'Donnell, when comparing Catalan and Scottish cases, I defend that current television fiction is not realist in a technical sense. It resembles discourses about reality, but not reality itself. What is portrayed is only recognized. Apart from this, it is true that to show in the screen a place close to the viewers have an impact on their sense of realism. In TV, the important is to offer possible worlds, which can be compatible with a realistic sense. Possible Wales, possible Catalonias, possible Spains. And about the sense of identification. I detected different levels from a high identification to a lower and even a no identification levels. Rural audiences in Catalonia have a high identification level on rural and urban TV drama, but urban audiences not. I would defend the same for Scotland. The people living in Barcelona and Glasgow feel that the portrait of the city is not so successful as people living in the countryside for rural productions. So River City is not such successful in that sense as High Road, which was the other. Finally, I found a no identification level with some viewers which occasionally or never watch Catalan fictions. They are suburban audiences, Spanish speaker with a working class origins and low levels of education, for example. They are interested in other kind of media and popular culture products. They simply do not identify with the worlds portrayed in the fiction. Finally, there are also huge differences for the ethnic minorities and immigrants. In Catalonia, we have a more recent immigration from North Africa, South America, and East Europe. And these people are simply not watching Catalan fiction as a recent research reveals. Anyway, some changes are perceived regarding a second generation viewer. Language. Wow, this is a huge matter. Maybe I would like to watch much more about this in your report, but for Catalan perspective, language is a major issue, as language is perhaps the reason of its existence, the existence of Catalan television. Catalan television uses standard Catalan as hegemonic accent for all programming, including drama. There is, of course, a token presence of other accents, Spanish accents, Occidental Catalan or Valencia accents, and Spanish is also spoken, but in TV drama only for specific situations. TV drama is not realist in linguistic terms. I would say the same for the BBC. Not all British audiences speak English, I suppose. But the drama cannot reproduce this diversity of language and accents. To put it simple, is it the drama duty? Or to put it complex? What matters is resemblance to reality. Example from Lleida. It's an inland region, rural region of Catalonia. I did a focus group on a tiny village in Lleida with a different accent. They watch Vendelplau, which is supposed to happen in the countryside. Despite Vendelplau is spoken in a standard Catalan, the people in Lleida say that they like the show and follow the story without problems. Even one of them said that the people in Vendelplau don't speak like in her village, but speak like in the villages. That's it. It really works. It's not like in my village, but it's like in the villages. I can recognize it. Huh? And they are not especially claiming to hear their own accent in television. A little bit about language. Language uses in the series also reproduce social and class structures in Catalonia. Catalan enjoys a high status. Although this is a complex city, it's complex. We find huge Spanish-speaking population among working class and low middle class, but we also find Spanish language in a urban high class in Barcelona, for example. It's quite difficult. My view here is that television tends to reproduce hegemony of real life. Lots of questions come to my mind. Can we try a completely bilingual or multilingual series? Welsh and English in the screen? Would this reproduce social reality? Would this be accepted? Who in the series would talk Welsh and who English? One TV producer told me that in television we can opt for the linguistic ellipsis. That is, we all know that not everybody in London talk in English. It is certainly a multicultural city, but we have a monolingual TV fiction which works fine in English only. This is his definition of linguistic ellipsis. So we accept that not everybody in that country speaks that language, but some immigrant characters speak in Spanish to reproduce reality, but one of the Spanish speakers participant in a focus group claimed that the duty of this character was to talk in Catalan. I asked about what language should talk some characters. A funny answer from some participant. The language they want, as if the characters have the choice to try any language. But the aim of the public TV to avoid a stereotype is not always successful. Social discourses are powerful and cannot be easily substituted. They must not be underestimated. For example, one of the Catalan series opted for the Catalan as the language of the members of an urban gang. Despite this was perceived as possible by the audience, they were aware that this kind of people usually talks in Spanish. Even this was said by a Spanish speaker. So the stereotypes remains. Indeed, if you want to break it or to avoid the stereotype, you can't avoid it so easily. About location. Back. Yes. Yeah. I was talking. Nobody told me nothing. Okay. Don't worry. Well, we have a completely different situation in Catalonia about this matter. The representation of urban spaces of Barcelona is not precisely a source of pleasure, as the urban audience see them as poor. This has to do with financial matters. But the fact is that Barcelona appears like a city of neighborhoods. The series are located in small communities in controlled spaces. We have not beauty shots, city lights, and outdoor shooting with crowds. TVC cannot use La Rambla as an outdoor studio. That is a pity. As I said, rural representations are more successful for all kinds of audiences, but are more of the same. And viewers would appreciate a high production profile. This also happened in Scotland, and people living in Bridge of Allan considered that High Road was pretty similar to their village, and they easily recognized the pub and even laughed at some of the situations depicted in the series, but they also would like other kind of representations. It's like something like limited. Now we can go. Positive reporting is also in Catalonia is quite similar, as the media and cultural industry is aware about the importance of TV production for the region. Some local companies are working thanks to TVC, and television fiction is promoting a better professional know-how among all the statements involved, producers, scriptwriters, actors, and so on. The press and other media follow the most TV fiction. Some of them are criticized, but there is a good reporting as a general idea. I'm finishing, almost finishing. Having compared the cases, I would like to highlight some opportunities and risks when reporting or portraying the national on television. These points you have here are a summary among other factors, but location, language, culture, history, and social portraits have lots of positive impact in terms of enriching social discourses, strengthening social cohesion, and others. And I would add that this is still more important in a small nations context. Otherwise, there are risks, like feeding stereotypes or telling a one-dimensional history, and also worrying too much about these matters can bring us far from the objective of television, which is to offer a successful TV shows in terms of quality and audience ratings. Today, checking my notes in the hotel I have at this end to start a discussion if you want, or to take coffee. The question would be, which Wales is portrayed in the BBC Wales fiction produced for the whole British network? I don't have the answer, but I would launch 3 options to discuss about. A. It is really the Wales meeting the public purpose of representing UK, its nations, regions, and communities, so Welsh people feel engaged to this. B. It is the Wales expected by the broad UK viewer, reproducing well-known discourses about the country which engage Welsh audiences and don't disturb broad UK viewers. And C, which would be a more painful option maybe. BBC fiction is not portraying Welsh society and culture, as is not the fiction commitment. Welsh locations are only a non-meaningful context where good and successful stories happen. It's only this comment to finish my speech. I hope my English has been understood. Thank you very much.
And following on from that, I mean, nationalism and nationhood and identity in Northern Ireland particularly is a very problematic issue. And I'm not going to go into the long history of politics there, but it's not really acceptable to, if you get up and say I'm proud of being Irish in a Belfast pub, you're really asking for trouble. And conversely, if you say, well, you know, God bless the Protestant religion, in a more nationalist area. So people have to be very cautious about how they express national identity, and I think that's a real shame. I think that it's an area of the UK which is struggling towards some kind of new identity. They haven't got there yet. Things to be proud of, not very easy. Sectarian violence, we can't really talk about that. That's not part of our cultural heritage. So what you get is the nationalists talking about Irishness and the Unionists or the Loyalists being Scottish, claiming a Scottish identity. Ulster Scots is the big thing. And I'm not sure that the Scots really want to claim the Ulster Loyalists. And the Republic of Ireland certainly distances itself from some of the more extreme forms of republicanism. So you've got these people who don't quite know where they belong. And I think one of the challenges, certainly for BBC Northern Ireland, if I may digress a bit, is trying to pull these different sorts of traditions together into something more positive, and I think they actually do a very good job. I'm very impressed with BBC Northern Ireland, and I hope they bring back Did My Headpiece in some form. But their news coverage and documentary, it's terrific. Okay, that's some of the serious things. Another interesting thing that struck me, there was a youth group in the Valleys who said, I get a sense of heritage from Doctor Who and Torchwood being filmed in Cardiff. And that brings up another definition of the word heritage for young people, which is often global. I mean, popular culture is heritage for the young. Popular music, popular drama, and it's nice if it's in Cardiff, but that heritage is something that I think we can work on as a unifying force, because young people everywhere do have popular culture emblems, popular culture tastes, which transcend these local ethnic and nationalistic differences in a very positive way. I've always been a big fan of popular culture. I said television was good for your kids a long time ago and got into a lot of trouble for it, but I think it is. I do. And I think there's evidence for that. Quickly moving on, Gavin and Stacey, yes, absolutely, and as I've just said, it's also about Essex. Let's not forget, and we need to make sure that they get it right. But one of the things that struck me about that, about Cardiff representing London and other places representing London, is that London as a place, speaking as a Londoner, gets obliterated. London isn't a place where anybody lives or comes from. It's the the symbol of empire, and it's the Tower of London and Westminster and all the rest of it. But if you actually live in London or come from London, if you come from part of London which isn't terribly fashionable, which I do, grew up in Leighton, brought up my children in Cheapford, which is sometimes known as Essex, at other times known as Norman Tebbett's constituency, so a little bit of negative. But it's a real place with real people, real ways of speaking, and quite often I think London and Londoners get lost, and I made the point about the accent. You never hear a London accent, not even on regional London news. You will not hear a London accent. That's not true of Welsh news or Scottish news or some other regional news. So let's hear it for London, and of course for Barry Island. Splendid place. Just a couple of very small things. Somebody mentioned Life on Mars and Tracy Beaker being made.
They were made by BBC Wales.
Made by BBC Wales, but not in Wales. Because
Tracy Beaker.
Well, this is a cause for pride, and I certainly think there's some, tourism or heritage to be exploited in Tracy Beaker, which is an absolute classic show, and incredibly popular with kids. And again, one of those shows that transcends region and nation and so on, because it's about a universal childhood experience. So let's hear a bit more about Tracy Beaker. It's very innovative and imaginative and clever. And my final point is just about this issue of representation, which I wanted to bring up in terms of its statistical meaning. Looking through your methodology section in the questionnaire, I wondered what the population ought to have been. You say you have 206. Out of how many? What's the response rate, as it were? I mean, how many? If every single person that you targeted had responded, do you know how many that would have been? Or was it just, because it was online, there was no way of knowing?
It's difficult to know what to quantify
so you don't know.
visuals my hands, really, so it's quite difficult for us to answer that authoritatively.
Because representative samples are very crucial in audience research. You have to be sure that the people you've talked to really do represent, in some way, not always completely, the population from which they're drawn. And that's quite difficult if you're doing open-ended sort of online question, and you know that as well as I do. But I think it's, as a general principle, and if we do more audience research on regional issues, which I hope we do, because I'd very much like to do it in Northern Ireland as well, then I think finding ways, and it's expensive, and I know it's time-consuming, but making sure your sample is representative is important as well. And those are the only points I have to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Maura. I'd suggest that we keep questions to a little bit later, because I'm just concerned that otherwise we'll run out of time completely. And that was really interesting, because there are a number of further complexities you've brought into the discussion. Next we'll hear from Dr. John Cook, who is Reader in Media at the Glasgow Caledonian University. Correct? Yes. So from Scotland now. Dr. Cook's main research and teaching interests are in television, cinema, and media studies. Published in numerous international journals, but also edited a number of articles and books on wide-ranging things: television history, science fiction, screenwriting. So, again, without wasting your time trying to introduce you, let's hear from you.
All right, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me here as well. I think I'm one of two Scottish representatives here today. The other one's from the BBC Audience Council in Scotland. And it's been fascinating. It's been fascinating reading the report. And I did have a go, and I read all of it from cover to cover, not just the executive summary. And also, clearly for me, reflecting on the relationship or the comparison between Wales and Scotland. And I've written on Scottish TV drama, written an essay, particularly an essay on the history of Scottish TV drama. Now, I come from a slightly different perspective, perhaps, to Maura, in terms of I'm particularly interested in the ecology, if you like, the production ecology of television drama, and how, for example, the undoubted success of Wales in recent years, in the last 5 years, which is a remarkable contemporary phenomenon, how that's impacted upon the sort of production context, both in Wales, of television drama and going forward for the future. But also the other small nations within the UK, and here in particular, of course, I'm interested in Scotland. And it was very interesting to hear Maura speak there about London and how she felt that London wasn't truly represented and in some sense effaced, because it's a commonplace that is often articulated that historically, in terms of the BBC, London has broadcast to Britain. That's actually a quote from Gus MacDonald, now Lord MacDonald, who was a former chief executive of Scottish Television, the commercial Scottish television company, STV. So it may not be real London, but it's in a sense certainly the dominance of the southeast in broadcasting to the rest of the UK is an historical fact. The BBC was set up, of course, by a Scot, John Ruth, the first Director General of the BBC, and he was more or less explicit in his centralising aims, which was to create a central network which would beam or transmit content first through radio to the whole of the UK, thus in a sense binding the nation together. So, I mean, it's interesting now that here we are almost 100 years later, and we're now, particularly the BBC, I think, concerned to look now from the other end of the telescope to particularly try and reflect the diversity that is increasingly in the UK in terms of the desire for more representations in the small nations and regions. Now, I would just make a couple of points in relation to Scotland, which will hopefully open up some of the debate that we've had today in relation to Wales, because I think at the moment Scotland is a fascinating mirror image of Wales. Because throughout most of its history, Scotland, BBC television drama in Scotland, is particularly what I'm focusing on, had far greater access to the network and far more TV drama hits, if you like, in the UK network as a whole than Wales ever did. BBC Scotland were the producers of, for example, Tutti Frutti, if you remember that, from the 80s, a famous TV drama written by John Byrne. Going a bit further back, it used to mount productions for the network of adaptations of Sir Walter Scott novels, such as The Master of Ballantrae, and also various other kinds of literary adaptations. Sunset Song, very famous one from the early 70s. But in the 2000s, Scotland made a conscious decision to turn inwards after the success of Monarch of the Glen, which ran from 2000 to 2005, BBC Scotland made a pretty conscious decision to actually invest much more on content produced just for the local Scottish audience. And the main production I want to focus on, which has already been mentioned briefly here today already, was the launch in 2002 of a dedicated soap for the local Scottish audience called River City. And the then head of drama at BBC Scotland, a woman called Barbara McKissick, said she thought what she was trying to do was to have something that would be just for Scotland itself, rather than, for example, something like Monarch of the Glen, which had represented, if you like, a form of tartanry, a sort of image of Scotland composed of heather and deer and wonderful lairds and estates that had no sort of relationship to certainly urban Scotland in the early 21st century. So River City, as it was called and is still running, was an attempt to represent an urban modern Scotland. But the problem with that is that in order to do so, to have the investment, BBC Scotland invested the bulk of its drama budget on River City. Now here we are at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, going into the second, 2010, and River City is beginning to falter. Although it still commands good ratings, it's moved from a twice-weekly slot to a 1-hour slot, which I was talking to somebody earlier who said that's often a sign that a soap is beginning to fail. So Scotland has gone inwards at the same time as Wales, through its tremendous fantasy hits of Torchwood and Doctor Who, has begun to look outwards. But the issue clearly for both cultures, I would say, is to what extent is it truly producing diversity in the range of representations? To what extent are we actually getting wider representations of Wales than we've ever had before? Or are we simply setting up sort of London production outposts in other small nations and regions? I think one of the key things that I picked out from the report, which maybe should make us a little bit more cautious, is on page 55, I think it was, that when they did their schedule analysis, the researchers found that there was, and I quote, virtually nothing that dealt with, in drama terms, Welsh history or contemporary social issues in dramatic form. Instead, what we have is sort of science fiction dramas that, in a sense, are using Wales, as was mentioned earlier, as a backdrop, but also importing UK stars and writers from elsewhere. Now, to what extent? I mean, clearly it's affected the confidence of Wales. Clearly, it's stimulated the craft production base, no question about it, and it's also clearly stimulating tourism as well. But to what extent it's actually creating a diversity of representations has got to be the question, I think, for moving forward. And it's a question that Scotland now needs to grasp as well, and I would argue probably Northern Ireland. Because what's happening is that the Welsh attempt to create a drama village, by bringing in shows like Casualty, for example, may have the effect actually of pushing out sort of other forms of representation of Wales. It's noticeable if you look at the BAFTA Cymru awards, how it's Torchwood Doctor Who that sweeps the awards. It's one of our plenary discussions earlier, one of our round table discussions, somebody mentioned in my group how the actual budget for regional drama, Welsh drama, was declining, indigenously produced Welsh drama. Meanwhile, Scotland is struggling to find its place in the drama ecology as a result of the tremendous success of Wales. So the success, paradoxically, of Doctor Who and Torchwood, which is tremendous. I'm a huge science fiction fan. I've edited television science fiction books, as was mentioned. I love Doctor Who and Torchwood. I love these shows. But paradoxically, they may be having both negative as well as positive effects on the TV drama production ecology throughout the UK. I'll end, actually, before opening it up, with a little quotation from John McCormick, who was controller of BBC Scotland and who retired in 2004 in BBC Scotland. And he said his ideal for a small nation TV drama department would be, for example, to have a £1.2 million film scheme on the one hand, popular drama, signature series for BBC Two or BBC Four, challenging work being commissioned, and a soap. He said if you've got that, you've got a rounded department. All that can happen from that is you develop in strength and underpin that. People come to you. That's the aim. Now, big question I think, which we maybe open up to the floor, I don't know, is has Wales currently got that? And do the other small UK nations, Scotland and Northern Ireland, also currently have that? I think this is the central question for stateless UK nations, of how basically to make drama in a still London production-centred broadcasting climate. And how you do that, how you make drama and also for the network, but also retain your own cultural distinctiveness. These would be some of the points that I picked up from the report.
Thank you.
We talked about the importance of aspiration. So is representation or portrayal about being real, or is it offering some sort of glamorised or idealised or desired version of the identity that's being kind of traded in? Term that came up very often was a kind of notion of authenticity, the importance that a notion of authentic representation could take on. And then of course we kind of questioned, well, what would that mean? There was a kind of an idea that this was about trying to almost instill in programme makers a sense of what audiences wanted. This was about the Audience Council and the BBC Trust moving forward an agenda which was structured around that kind of notion of what's authentic for the audience, rather than kind of being driven by perhaps producers' assumptions, which in some cases might be inaccurate, using a kind of South Wales actress in a drama that was about North Wales and then kind of being shot down for that. Also the importance of success in relation to nations and regions feeling kind of proximity and ownership. That if Doctor Who had been a kind of an absolute clunker, if it had been kind of dreadful, which as a Doctor Who fan I would have been very upset, but if that had been dreadful, then presumably Welsh audiences wouldn't have kind of wanted to be linked with the brand or be associated with it. So the importance of kind of quality TV, if you like, almost sort of without that, the debate kind of can't really kind of follow on. And then just to kind of round up then, also talks about the importance of kind of different genres. So surely it is significant what a television programme is claiming to do. Is it claiming to be social realist? Is it claiming a kind of realist type of representation? Or is it like Doctor Who and Torchwood making a completely different textual claim that audiences will respond differently and will evaluate representation and portrayal differently in relation to the genre that is involved, and that is significant. We talked about many other things for more than half an hour, but I should stop there.
We look at impact, and I'm going to be just synopsis here. We look at impact and what impact portrayal is to Wales, and we come up with several analogies, and we look at identity. We look at recognition, individualities. We look at diversity, and we look at, representation. And for us, we think, or a lot of us think, that representation represent a lot of the ideas and the people's characteristics and their culture, which is all part of portrayal. And we look at Doctor Who, Torchwood, and we believe, or it was suggested, that although Doctor Who represents Cardiff, Doctor Who carries a tremendous publicity that engages everyone from the outside of Cardiff. Because Doctor Who was, in the beginning, a very successful program. There was some sort of skepticism. We won't go there. And of course, Wales is a young city. And for those reasons, the publicity and the skepticism and the youngness of the city embraces Doctor Who and allow it to flourish. So therefore, everyone sees Doctor Who as a part of their life. It becomes part of the family structure, as it were. Even those like myself who never liked Doctor Who, I'm there. And so, Torchwood, on the other hand, Torchwood represents a different feel, because Torchwood gives a picture, and that picture represents an identity of someone, somewhere, something, and we can relate to that. And for that reason, we can see that portrayal does have its meaning and does have its credibility in Torchwood. And what we believe that these two programs have given us Welsh. And if you notice, I said the word Welsh. I'm black, I'm Jamaican, but I'm Welsh. It gives us Welsh the reason to believe in who we are. And that is very important. It also helped Wales to become stronger and to be able to not make demand, but to be more forceful on the front line, as it were, in order to maintain the credibility from Doctor Who and Torchwood.
John was part of the discussion around our table, and so one of the things we did talk about was the types of programmes that are being produced in Wales. One thing to talk about, for example, is that, well, okay, there's been a concentration on sci-fi at the moment. What happens if sci-fi goes out of fashion again? A number of productions are coming to Cardiff, and that's a positive thing, but how many of them, if any of them, will actually portray Cardiff or Wales? And we talked about, well, actually, if, say, Sherlock is filmed in Cardiff, why can't they say it's Cardiff? Why do they have to pretend that it's London? What, do we have this? Can we not believe that quality programming could come from somewhere other than London? Why do we have to pretend a location is somewhere other than what it is? But equally, we started talking about people's different identities and this complex idea around portrayal and identity. And what we talked about was the need for positive portrayals of different communities, particularly different minority communities, whether that's related to sexual orientation or ethnicity or anything else. And actually, in some ways, whether that comes from Wales or not is less important than that those positive representations exist. Positive representations of gay culture from Liverpool are just as valuable in many ways as ones that would be based in Wales. And we just wondered if maybe, particularly in a global world where people have so many different influences and so many different identities, whether actually geography and where you live is less and less important, and all the other communities are more and more important.
We talked about the complexity of identity, and that if you film programs in a particular area, you might not recognise that area as being your area, your Cardiff, if you like, because of the way in which the city here is changing. We talked a little bit about how interesting it was, I think, that in the research in North Wales, despite the fact that Doctor Who and Torchwood was filmed mostly in South Wales, there was still a claiming of it as an identity, which is quite interesting and rather goes against quite a lot of the other forms of cultural identity within Wales. And I think a third issue that we discussed was, did Casualty do for Bristol what Doctor Who and Torchwood do for Cardiff and South Wales? And apparently, Louise reminded us in the early days they used to have ooh-ah accents, and references to the southwest, but they've disappeared, so it's now kind of anywhere, Casualty anywhere. So there's an interesting question, I think, if it moves to Wales, whether the city that Casualty is based in will also be seen as having somehow miraculously moved to Wales, or will it remain any town? So there were lots of other things as well. I was facilitating, so it was a free-ranging kind of anarchic discussion.
The Trust is very grateful to the Audience Council Wales for taking this project forward with this. We rely very much on the audience councils. The 4 audience councils have come up with a number of things that the Trust has taken forward, and portrayal, we have recognized, is something that audiences really want us to move on, and it's such a complex issue as this afternoon has shown, and we are really trying to move it on. So this has been a really good afternoon for getting us a little further on in the discussion. But at the end of the day, really what audiences want is to see it on their screen and to hear it on the radio. So essentially, we have to work with program makers and commissioners to get this where we want it. So I'm very pleased. I'm going to leave you with a little challenge now to discuss while we go into our reception area, and which is a lot of what's said. It struck me as we went through the afternoon, and particularly in the final bit there, that it's wonderful. What audiences want to see is positive portrayal, or give a good sense. Everybody wants the positive to be portrayed. And Maura mentioned the acceptability of the negative. And I think that's the necessity. I think yes, I was saying the acceptability, the necessity. So really, how do audiences feel about that? And I think that's something that we could discuss.